Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second event in our webinar series, Shifting Paradigms, Populist Politics and the Future of Liberal Order. My name is Merve İspahani. I'm the Academic Programs Manager at Columbia Global Centers, Istanbul. I'm delighted to open today's session, which is being organized in collaboration with our global centers in Amman and Santiago, along with the Committee on Global Thought. For those of you joining us for the first time, Columbia Global is a pioneering initiative that brings together major entities across the university, including our 11 global centers and the Committee on Global Thought, to address humanity's most complex challenges. Our mission is to connect rigorous scholarship with the pressing realities of the world today. The global centers function as hubs for intellectual exchange, bridging regions, disciplines, and communities. The Committee on Global Thought plays a critical role in advancing new frameworks and perspectives that reflect our rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. This series is a reflection of what Columbia Global does best, creating spaces for dialogue that challenge assumptions and spark new ideas. Today's session, focused on populist politics and the future of liberal international order, speaks directly to one of the most defining shifts in the current global moment. Over the past decade, populist leaders have reshaped political landscapes across the globe, often ascending through democratic processes while simultaneously undermining the very norms, institutions, and alliances that underpin the liberal international order. Despite differing domestic priorities, these leaders are united by a deep skepticism of multilateralism, international cooperation, and liberal democratic values. This shift has introduced a profound tension in global affairs, weakening collective action on critical challenges such as climate change, migration, and public health emergencies. The result is a global landscape increasingly marked by fragmented alliances, eroding trust in international institutions, and the rise of what some have called a new illiberal internationalism. We are honored to have a distinguished group of panelists with us today to help explore these issues. Sherry Berman is a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She has written about these topics for a wide variety of scholarly and non-scholarly publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. She currently serves on the boards of the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science Quarterly. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, From the Ancien Regime to the Present Day, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Senem Aydın Düzgit is a professor of international relations at Sabancı University, Istanbul, and the director of the Istanbul Policy Center. She is also a Pierre Keller Visiting Professor of Public Policy, Harvard Kennedy School, and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University. In 2023-24, she was based at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. She holds a PhD from Virgin University, Brussels, and MSc from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA from Boğaziçi University. Her main research interests include identity, history, and discourse in the study of international politics, with an empirical focus on European and Turkish foreign policies, and more recently, the nexus between domestic and foreign policies of middle powers in the changing international order. Fernando Alvarado is a partner and geopolitical and political risk consultant in Windward Observer Consulting, an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Economics at Pontificia University Católica de Valparaíso, and an adjunct professor at University Adolfo Ibáñez School of Liberal Arts. Additionally, he held a Fulbright chair at the Kellogg Institute, University of Notre Dame. Previously, he served as the Director of International Relations at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and other institutions. Fernando holds a master's degree from Heidelberg University and a PhD from Free University Berlin. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to our moderator, Adam Tooze, Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History and Chair of the Committee on Global Thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merve. It's a real pleasure to be here again, and thank you again for this wonderful collaboration that we've struck up between the Committee of Global Thought at Columbia in New York and the Global Centers in Istanbul, Amman, and Santiago this morning. This morning in New York, that is. It's a real pleasure, and one of our missions in this evolving series of conversations has been to bring together folks speaking from different vantage points around the planet on issues of mutual concern. And obviously this morning, with your help, we've managed to assemble a really wonderful panel to do that. It's really great to be here with everyone. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I mean, when I think about this issue, one of the things I often get stuck with, and I have to admit I go back and forth on this year by year as the issue of populism has come to the center and again over the last more than 10 years now, is how far that we see it as I'm going to scarecrow this a little bit just for purposes of debate. How far we see of this as a unitary phenomenon, as something where we can really point to very strong common lines, and it makes sense to discuss the question of whether or not X or Y government, X or Y regime belongs in this category or not, or how far we're dealing with a much looser kind of chain of associations, perhaps with some common causes, perhaps with a degree of interaction between them, kind of copycat authoritarian populism, but without that sense that we are facing the uprising of a new thing which challenges another thing, which would be the liberal international order. So that is perhaps, I thought, and from our prior discussions, it seemed to me that this would be an obvious place to begin our conversation this morning. What are we actually dealing with? And Senem, I know that you've given a great deal of thought to this. You obviously speak from a particular vantage point with a particular angle out on the world. I'd love to hear how you see this as no one has to commit here, and these are heuristic questions. In other words, another way of reframing this is how useful might it be to think about this as a unitary phenomenon or as something more amorphous?
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you so much for having me in today's webinar. Well, I do agree with your point that I don't think we're looking at a kind of a unified, coherent set of movements, but perhaps something a bit more amorphous, something a bit more loose that we see across the world, however. So it does not just pertain to one region or another, but we see it as a global phenomenon. And again, in relation to that, I don't think that we can identify a single factor that explains the rise of these movements. So, it can be down to the economy, culture, demographic factors, fragile institutions, etc. So I think we'd have to look at individual cases to see which factors, figure most than others in certain particular cases that we're looking at. Now, I think, having said that, there are certain commonalities that we are seeing, that we are observing across a number of cases. One, of course, that often we see the rise of movements, mostly as we refer to them as populist authoritarian leaders or parties, that present themselves as the true democrats, those that define the true interests of the people rather than the so-called elites or the elites of a previous regime, which they think or they deem rather illegitimate for various number of reasons. And they're tapping into certain existing popular resentments in those countries, whichever country you're looking at. Again, those resentments might be cultural based, they might be economic based, etc. There might be different reasons there, but there is often a certain sense of popular resentment which these movements seem to be tapping into. Of course, another commonality perhaps that we're looking at is institutional capture. In many populist authoritarian movements, we see often gradual, perhaps in the US case, this is less gradual than many other cases, but in many cases, we see a more gradual movement towards institutional capture, where these movements try to capture certain parts of the state apparatus, be it the judiciary, independent institutions, and also the media. And I think the media landscape is particularly important if you look at cases like, for instance, Hungary or India or Turkey, where you see competitive authoritarian or populist authoritarian leaders who have been in power for quite a long time now manage to control much of the media landscape and, through that landscape, communicate a certain version of facts or developments to the general public, which we see is extremely important and influential in constricting the democratic space. And of course, another and a final, perhaps, or no, two points that I'd like to make before I close this round, but ethno-nationalism. In many of these countries, we see also a politics of hate that's been driven by these populist authoritarians, a certain politics of stigmatization, if you'd like to call it. And also, and this is going to be my final point, we're also looking at the presence of an international context, which is in fact enabling this turn towards populist authoritarianism. Why or how is this happening? Well, I mean, in very broad terms, we can talk about the loosening of this weakening of a Western linkage that used to exist. I think, we should even question whether we can talk about the West the way that we did talk about it, let's say a decade ago, or perhaps even 5 years ago. Like recently, European Commissioner, the head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she also stated that we're not looking at the same West that we were looking at before. So there is a weakening of that Western linkage and a significant weakening of that also with the US out of the picture, and the rise of multipolarity. So, for instance, from where I'm standing today in Istanbul, when we look at, for example, how Erdogan secured a very narrow victory in 2023 presidential elections, we have seen how he played different powers at work to gain certain financial concessions from countries like Russia, from the Gulf states, for instance, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia at the time. And now we're seeing, again, Turkey's efforts to have closer investment ties with China. So financially speaking, often these multipolar links benefit these leaders to remain in power. At least it increases their options, and it definitely lowers the cost of these countries' turn towards authoritarianism, as we've been seeing in the Turkish case with the recent arrest of the Istanbul mayor, and how this went largely unnoticed in Western press and media and even in political circles. So I think I'll finish that for the first round, and then I can come into the discussion as we go along. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Senem, for that incredibly capacious framework. That's really a great scene setter. Cherie, Fernando, do you want to come in on this opening round? Cherie, excellent.
Okay, I'll be happy to start, and also thanks again for inviting me to this conversation. So I would say, your question is a good one, but it's hard to answer in a sort of definitive way. I would say on some level, on the broadest level, there obviously are global trends here, right? So if we were to take sort of decades as time frames, obviously we can see that there are very noticeable global trends, right? So in 2010, for instance, 15 years ago, we were at the height of sort of the number of democracies that existed in the world, right? So that obviously started in the late 20th century, and it continued up until about 2010 or 2011, when we just kept seeing, sort of increasing numbers of countries shifting from some kind of authoritarianism to some kind of democracy. In the last 10 or 15 years, things have gone in the opposite direction, right? We've seen countries that we would have broadly characterized as democracy sort of sliding away from that more clear-cut democratic category, and also at the same time, fewer countries making new transitions. So on some level, clearly we are now in a period where very few people think this is kind of, a sort of global forward democratic moment, right? But so whether underneath those broad trends, right, democracy versus autocracy, we can see some patterns, I think that is somewhat less clear. So from a historical perspective, I'm a historically minded political scientist. I would say that the idea that there would be backsliding after a giant democratic wave is not surprising. So if we look back at earlier periods in history, whatever, 1848, after the First World War, after the Second World War, those were periods when we saw lots of countries making transitions to democracy. They were all followed by very, very strong undertows. That is to say, many of those new democracies proved to be weak, slid back into autocracy, yada, yada. So the fact that we are now 15 years after the height of the number of democracies in the, in the world system, that we are now in this kind of undertow, this backward sort of trajectory, that is not historically surprising. And it's not just a question of history repeating itself just because it does. There's a lot of causal reasons for that, right? Political scientists would say, many countries that make transitions don't have, whatever, the prerequisites or the necessary conditions to make democracy work. And so we would expect that a lot of these democratic experiments would not just be weak, but fail. So yes, but not perhaps historically surprising. Now, that said, I'm not suggesting that we should have foreseen all of the things that are happening today. That's obviously ridiculous. There are many things that are indeed surprising and historically anomalous. I would say the most obvious of which is what's going on in the country Atom and Iron, which is in the United States, where really a democracy that we had taken for granted for many, many, many, many generations now clearly is undergoing its severest test in a very, very long time. So there are anomalous trends, and there also are differences, I would say, among the broad category of regimes that we would put in the democratic or the authoritarian category. There's lots of backward movement, as I said, but the mechanisms of those democratic declines and the type of regimes that exist within those countries vary quite a bit. So that was a long-winded way of answering Adam's question, which is, yes, I think there are some broad and very noticeable trends. I think once we get below that kind of macro level of analysis, things get more complicated. And it's worth thinking, I would say, in particular about both how backsliding has occurred in different parts of the globe and the nature of the regimes that now exist in these places. I would not characterize, despite the tendency, I think, of many smart analysts to, for instance, throw around terms like fascism to describe what currently exists in the United States. I say that only because, having spent a lot of time thinking about the interwar period, I don't like using terms loosely. That said, I think it's very important for us to think within these categories about what's going on and to differentiate, if only because it will tell us something about what the options for dealing with the current situation are.
Thank you, Shri. That's absolutely excellent. That gives us like a historical path depth to Senem's, kind of coolly analytic dissection. I'm with you on the fascism thing. I see that more as a reflection of the historic logic that you're pointing to, which is, after all, this is perhaps not all that surprising. There is a sense in which we've seen various patterns like this before, and it's very difficult to resist then the crude analogy that says it's the same thing back, which I think is not. We could talk about that more maybe in a minute. Fernando, I'd love to get your take. In our pre-discussion, you were saying that you were tempted by the idea, at least, that Latin America sees a particular ecosystem at work, a particular logic of populism. I'd be fascinated to hear more about that.
Sorry, I will drink some water.
Yeah, we have the same problem. It must
Yeah,
be
I have a cold.
hemispheric. Oh, look, there's Sherry on her hot drink as well. It's clearly a hemispheric thing that we're suffering here.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the invitation. And I think the question that we have discussed with some colleagues and for the last weeks and maybe months is the first one is in Latin America. Maybe it's not a very particular part of the world, but the good news is we have had democracy for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 decades, for the last 3 or 2 decades. And if you look what's happened in the last years here in Latin America, and especially in South America, the question is how much has liberal democracy failed to give answers to citizens' demands? So there are a lot of analysis about what's the reason to increase populism and to increase dictatorships in the world and so on and so on. No? I can remember my PhD professor from Berlin, Professor Marianne Breit, said when political elites move away from citizens' demands, a space it generates, which is sometimes occupied by populism. No? If we look, for example, Trump's inauguration speech in January in 2017, he said that every 4 years the ceremony has a very special meaning because there's not only a transfer from one government to the other, from Obama to Trump at this time, but also is a transfer from the power from Washington DC and given back to the people. No? That's one of the most significant concept that some populism are mentioned in the world. Milei, for example, the president from Argentina, they talk about la casta política, no? the political caste, and they are all corrupt. So we have to eliminate all this casta, and Bolsonaro has the enemies from Bolsonaro, the political elites, no? And so on and so on. So if you look the context in Latin America, it's not very different. If you look, for example, in Europe, but there are some specific strategies there you can find. There are look different. For example, a lot of people they said Trump and Milei they have the same strategy. So the populism, for example, in the States at this moment or in Argentina, are the same. I think Milei it's different from Trump because he despises the states. He tried to eliminate the states and tried to reduce states to a minimum expression, no? And Trump occupied the states, occupies the rise of tariff as a geopolitical weapon. So if you look in some studies here in Chile, we have increasing from populism in Chile, and a lot of new candidates and new leaderships, they are moving to discuss the same objective and the same strategy like Milei, like Bukele, and some others populist candidates in Latin America. And some 63% of response agrees to strongly agreed that the political difference between the elites and the citizens are greater than the difference between citizens. No? And a lot of them they agree to eliminate some citizens' rights and have more security and more authorities, and to reduce or to weaken the liberal democracy. So I think it's a global issue. It's a global topic, but in Latin America we began to have more and more populism, left populism, but also right populisms, and I think we will move also in Chile. We don't have a great history about populism in Chile, but we will maybe in the next year move also to have a stronger populist movement in our country.
Thank you, Fernando. That adds another very interesting dimension, which is that interactive one. In other words, we had with Senem these different dimensions and facets of populism. Cherie gave us the sort of long historical view. And with you, I heard, that key phrase, populism in a sense feeds on the dissatisfaction with its with the alternatives. In other words, what democracy has delivered in recent decades. And when left-wingers, liberal progressives, tend to think about why it is that democracy has not delivered, the standard answer is neoliberalism. The standard answer is some combination of the willful adoption of an ideology and actual constraints that come from the liberally architected international financial system based above all on the free movement of capital. And I will admit to being one of the sort of left centrists who I think in the back of their mind, I've come increasingly to realize, counted on the force of global capital markets to protect us, not just, or rather, it frustrated ambitions of radical reform on the left, but it was also there to protect us, in a sense, against authoritarian moves to the right. And there was a sense, notably after Brexit, but also in many other locations, is that at some point the sky will fall, financial gravity will reassert itself, and the world will come back to order. And moving from the first part of our discussion to the second part of our discussion, which is populism and the liberal international order, my starting kind of puzzlement here is, why do these constraints not operate more powerfully? Is this some strange moment of the autonomy of the political, in which an Erdogan, for instance, can walk the fine line of the global financial market episode after episode after episode, and the big crash never happens? Brexit, which really should have been like, a shot to the brain of the British economy, will produce long-run debility, but didn't produce a mega crisis. In the United States right now, we're asking ourselves this same question. Is there a way in which one of the things we tended to do, perhaps, was just underestimate how strong these constraints were? By implication, therefore, we overestimated the constraints on progressive politics and underestimated the lack of political will. And is one of the things that we're dealing with authoritarians, for better and for worse, the fact that these guys, they're all guys, well, Meloni is the exception, they have political will. Whatever you may think about an Erdogan or an Orban or a Trump, or for that matter, a Bolsonaro or a Milei, these people have a project. And they're willing to take risks. And I would love to have some insights from you on how you see that aspect, right? It's a little bit like Obama watching in that bizarre interview where he says, just imagine if I'd done any of this shit. Like, and many of us on sort of the progressive left go, well, why didn't you? Like, why didn't you try? Why are these people willing to take these risks and you not? And when they do take these risks, they discover the constraints, the guardrails are not actually as robust as we thought. So in a sense, we hobbled ourselves when we did have power from the point of view of democracy. And now it's the enemies of the right that actually get to exploit this weakness that we never were willing to really open up. Anyway, I'd love to get your vantage point on this. Autonomy of the political is one of the things that Cherie has struggled with in her work in fascinating ways. Senem, yours is in Turkey, to me, is the really standout case of this. Is this Senem?
Shall we go in the same order?
Yeah, why not? There's no...
Okay. Well, just a few thoughts, response to what you've just been saying. Well, I mean, in the Turkish case, I think, and this is not just something specific to the Turkish case, I think you could make the case for instance, Modi, in India as well, that they do deliver to some extent. So it's not as if that these leaders...
Output legitimacy.
Exactly. It's not that they're not delivering at all. They are delivering just enough. Yeah. Just enough to win votes in highly polarized and majoritarian contexts. So if you look at Erdogan, and of course, if you look at, messy macroeconomic indicators in Turkey today, just forget that for a minute and go back to, a few years back. And then you'd see that Turkey has been, going through a period of economic growth, expansion of middle classes, social safety nets were there and they multiplied in terms of quite good public health services, etc. So Erdogan was seen as a deliverer, especially in comparison to previous coalition governments and and you know, those governments that basically failed spectacularly. And again, if you look at Modi, you know, he's not bad at macroeconomic management, and he did actually manage to build state capacity in certain areas. So it's not that they are completely failing on all fronts, but it's important, I think, to note that they are delivering just enough that's needed to win elections in polarized settings. And here, I think cultural polarization plays an important role in cases like Turkey, in places like India, perhaps even in the United States, that cultural-based polarization where you really have to win, let's say, somewhere between 1% to 5%, that electorate in the middle. And for instance, you know, just to give an example from the 2023 Turkish elections again, and we published a paper in the Journal of Democracy last year about those elections. You know, it was a paper called How Erdogan Rules Through Crisis. And basically there, my argument was, well, because it looked as if he gave the message that he was delivering. He basically overspent and, you know, did early retirement. He just delivered enough financially to certain groups that were undecided. That was just enough for him to go the 50% threshold to win those elections. Well, of course, I mean, all that overspending meant a much worse Turkish economy after the elections, but that's just enough for Erdogan. You know, it's not the long-term or even medium-term interest of the country or the state. You know, he probably, you know, they're going to figure out how to win in the next 4 or 5 years, but that was just enough for last year. And that's how he won. Because the rest was already polarized. You know, the rest of the electorate had already made up their minds, no matter how they were faring. So it's just, and also, I think there's still, again, whether or not the economy will be a constraining factor also depends ultimately on, first of all, what the populist authoritarians are trying to get away with, and also the economic situation that they are currently in. For instance, if you look at what Turkey is going through today, you see that Erdogan is not really getting away so much with imprisoning the leader of the main opposition. Well, the mayor, who is, of course, going to be the next presidential candidate of the main opposition. So, I mean, there are two things that are preventing the government to go forward with further arrests or imprisonments or perhaps even closure of the opposition party. One is active societal mobilization of the opposition, basically people on the streets, that's what it is. And the second one is the economy, because you have foreign currency reserves being depleted. The ones that had been built, you know, accumulated to some extent with huge costs to the public right after the elections, they've all been lost in a couple of days. And now we see the kind of the government in defense. So there is a constraining factor still, even though much less than perhaps there used to be.
Shuri, do you want to come in on this? I'm tempting you, I hope.
Yep. Sure, and thank you, Senem. Those were very helpful comments. I'll let me say a couple of things to your question, Adam. The first part of your question is, look, you know, the whole rationale for adopting neoliberalism in the late 90s was that the previous kind of economic regime was no longer, you know, sort of really producing growth. The 70s and 80s were very difficult economic times in the West. And what we've seen now by 2025 is that this, you know, sort of transition to neoliberalism has not produced much better results at all. And the reason why this is important, well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but directly relevant to our conversation is, you know, whether or not, or how difficult it is to maintain support for democracy in an era where we cannot take significant growth for granted. And that's really a sort of meta question that advanced industrial democracies are facing right now, right? Which is that, you know, if we look at the sort of the universe of advanced industrial countries, essentially, you know, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, parts of Asia, we really have not seen anything near the kind of growth rates that we had sort of come to take as expected during the post-war period, when democracies in Western Europe, Japan, were really going through their consolidating phase. That era is gone. Neoliberalism has not brought it back at all. And so we are dealing with this question of whether or not much of the democratic success that we in the advanced industrial world took for granted, how much of that was dependent on an economy that was growing and therefore generated fewer what political scientists like to call zero-sum conflicts. So that's one question that I think really we don't have a really good answer to, but I think is a really very difficult one to grapple with. To get back to something that Senem said, which I think is very important, one thing is that a lot of these people, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, Donald Trump in the United States, right-wing populists in Europe, they're really running on, there is a lot of discontent with the state of the economy, with the sense that people are suffering from really debilitating levels of economic insecurity, yada, yada, but they are running on social and cultural grievances. And so this insulates them to some degree, I would say not entirely, but to some degree from some of the economic things that you were mentioning, Adam, right? Which is that their voters are voting for them primarily on the basis of these kind of social and cultural grievances. And then another thing that Senem said is once you get these kinds of levels of polarization we see in places like the United States, Turkey, levels of polarization that are growing in Europe, is people really become insulated from not just information that is discordant with their political preferences, but they actually just interpret the world around them in very different ways. We can see this very clearly in the United States, Adam, where people just are the information that is out there is just being seen in entirely different ways by folks who are strong Democratic partisans versus Republican partisans. I'm sure that is very similar in places like Turkey and other highly polarized places. So this gives populists some insulation from these kinds of economic downturns. I would say, however, right, and I will defer definitely to Senem on the Turkish case, but from what I know about other cases, long-term economic problems do matter. They do matter. You can only fudge reality and distract people towards their social and cultural grievances for so long. If economic conditions do not improve or worsen, people will see that. And then the question becomes for populists, do you react to that by using further oppression? In other words, to stop the opposition from capitalizing on that, right? Something that we see that in Turkey, we've seen that in Hungary and other places. Or do you allow elections to go forward and allow people to express that discontent? So I think, with regards to economic questions, they can be, I think, by populists deferred for longer than they can be by small d Democrats. But over time, economic discontent will erode, I think, support for or legitimacy of any regime. But it's unclear, I think, exactly how that will play out. It depends, again, on how much repression exists or incumbent leaders are willing to use to sort of blunt the impact of that.
Yeah, I was really shocked to read a couple of weeks ago about the first case in which a JP Morgan financial analyst publicly censored the statements they made about the prospects for the US economy. I think it was a provocative, demonstrative act, but that does begin to take us into Modi Erdogan territory, where even the communication in the financial analyst community begins to take on an aspect so political that JP Morgan doesn't want to be seen trash talking about Trump's prospects for 2026. Fernando, in our pre-conversation, I prompted you a little bit about the business side of things, and you came back to me with a really interesting set of comments about institutions. And this seems to me another one of those liberal conceits, right? So one liberal conceit is we built the neoliberal 1990s order in part deliberately to constrain political discretion, right? The idea was that you could escape the stagflation trap of the 70s and 80s by building non-discretionary economic policy institutions that would do the right thing, and that would optimize whatever modest level of growth we were able to obtain. And now we see these people exercising extraordinary discretion and getting away with it, at least in the short run. I think another profound centrist liberal belief, conceit, idea is that big, modern, sophisticated societies need deep, complex institutional structures. You can see it in Max Weber, you can see it in the liberal tradition going all the way back to the 18th century, to the constitutional tradition. We really are quite devoted to the idea that you need that structure, and we couldn't live with the capriciousness, the arbitrariness of what economists call original sin. In other words, an unconstrained sovereign. And I wonder whether that too is part of the challenge of the current moment, that maybe liberals and a large part of the progressive left also underestimated the extent to which we might be able to cope actually with a far higher degree of institutional manipulation, flow, capriciousness than we like to believe. Anyway, I would love to, and Latin America is generally taken as a kind of test bed for this, right? As one of the zones where this question of the limits of arbitrary governance are really being exposed. I'd love to get your take on this.
Thank you very much, Adam.
In Latin America, I see that.
Sorry. I think if you look the history of Latin America, of course, you look the 70s with a lot of dictatorships, especially right wings dictatorships, Pinochet, also in Argentina, Brazil, well, I think in 90% of the countries. And then in the 80s, Latin America moved to this neoliberal system, no? So with a lot of economic opening reforms. And the maybe 80, 90% of the countries, they maintain the same economic strategy in this time. No? I think if you look the populist movement in the last years in Latin America, especially in South America, and especially if you look Argentina and also El Salvador, maybe Bolsonaro also, they are not a great, they don't have a massive economic problems. It looked like they are beginning to move to improve the economy in this country, but of course with some institutional problems. So the big first question here is to have better economy in South America. Do you have to elect populist candidates? Is this the first message that we will have in this world with massive problems with this trade war from the states? And the second one is if you look the problems with the international alliance in the context in Latin America, the impact of populist government is less significant. And the reason is because the member of this regional agreements, the institutional framework is also weak or has massive problems. No? So if you look, for example, some economic alliance or trades like Mercosur, like the Pacific Alliance and others, have not generated major opposition so far from this populist presidents, like, for example, Milei, because the impact and the influence in the regional economy of these agreements, it's not so massive like the European Union or some other agreements, regional agreements in the world. Maybe for Lula is Mercosur and especially Mercosur since they reach an agreement with the European Union very important. But in my opinion, the message that we began to receive here in Chile and also especially in Argentina, maybe in Peru and for the next years, also Colombia, is that the populism can be a very good strategy to improve economy, to increase economy, and have some better quality of life for the normal citizens.
Yeah, so a real inversion of the standard centrist assumptions. I mean, in the brief for this panel, the emphasis is really on international order and international structures. And I wonder whether any of you see a particularly distinctive, I mean, Fernando, you already, in fact, very helpfully started talking about the role that arrangements like Mercosur do or do not play for populists in Latin America. Do you see a distinctive style, Shari Sinem, of this loosely, configured group in relation to international order, as opposed to liberalism in general, that specific issue, that specific domain?
Okay, well, I mean, good question. But then the answer is not so easy, because I think some of them have a different outlook on the order than the others. But if I'd have to generalize, if we have to sort of,
we're in the business of generalizing,
yeah, generalizing or kind of broad brushing a little bit, maybe one could make the argument that they're generally in favor of multipolarity, or the rise of multipolarity, and having basically more options than before. So multipolarity works in their favor. And what you see in the discourse of many of these leaders, foreign policies, is a focus on the need for autonomy, strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you can treat strategic autonomy as a kind of a floating signifier, because, the European Union talks about strategic autonomy as well, but in a very different sense of the term than when Erdogan talks about it, or when Modi talks about it, or when, by the way, Orban also talks about strategic autonomy, although it's hard to see what he means by that in particular, but still. But I think what we see in these powers' discourses on strategic autonomy is basically an autonomy from the West, and a search for autonomy with a view to attain regime security. So in a way, their outlook on international order is conditioned by what they see as fundamental moves to sustain regime security. And of course, the constitutive pillars of that regime security differ from one context to another. For instance, in the Turkish case, you can, the Kurdish issue is one of those, right? Or a bit, Turkey's state capitalism and how Erdogan feels the need to expand beyond Turkey's borders, to Iraq and Syria, etc., to satisfy its economy and the model that basically he created that also helps to, keep the ruling coalition intact and in power. So again, but I think that's how we should approach the analysis of their outlook on international order. So that is why it's difficult to talk about one singular outlook. But of course, again, that's also the case for how they view international law, for instance, right? I mean, I think it would be too much of a kind of a generalization, too broad brush to say that they're generally against, international law or legal order. Well, if you look at how Erdogan votes, for instance, or how Turkey votes in the UN in the United Nations, you would see that it's actually very much aligned with international law and issues like Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, etc. So again, one would have to be have a bit of a differentiated outlook on how these powers perceive certain parts of international law in order to their benefits and use them as such. And one final thing, perhaps, if I have one more minute, not perhaps, as a direct response to what you just raised, but also something that Shari mentioned, and I think it's very, very important, that basically, Shari is right. I mean, they can't govern economically well enough for too long. But having said that, it's also a matter of time. So it's all about how much institutional capture would have happened to that point, right? How much media capture, how much co-optation, how much repressive power have they managed to accumulate up until that point, up until they reach that point that Shari has alluded to? Because once they do reach a certain critical limit, then of course, the question in the public's mind is, well, things are going wrong, but where does the responsibility lie at the end of the day, right? I mean, look at Orban, again, Hungary. Maybe he was going to win the elections anyway, but one thing that really boosted his popularity was the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, something has to do that relates to international order, so your question again, and the rise of multipolarity, which also give rise to these regional conflicts here and there. But then sometimes these regional conflicts, like the war, works in favor of these movements, right? So he managed to silence all the other critics and said, well, look, we're not in a great state right now, but then I will deliver you cheaper energy, you'll be much better off with me than with the opposition, right? So it's all a relative appraisal of also how credible the opposition is. And once you control the information landscape, then you have a much stronger sort of space to make that argument.
Thank you, Sinem. Shuri, do you have a thoughts on this issue of international order from the point of view of these regimes, these administrations?
Well, yes. I mean, although maybe it's slightly different since I come at it, I think from a sort of more of a domestic oriented perspective. Look, there's simply no doubt that on some broad level, sort of as your initial question sort of got at, there are global trends, right? And global trends don't exist, up in the air, right? They exist because there's some underlying sort of causal mechanism there, right? And so there's simply no doubt that, if the quote unquote hegemon is democratic, that tends to have knock-on effects for regimes in other parts of the world. Sometimes those knock-on effects are very direct and we can see them, right? So the hegemon is democratic. It will support other democratic regimes, both rhetorically and materially. Also, there's the kind of desire to be like whatever countries seem the most successful. So during the post-war period, the advantage of the United States in the eyes of many was not just that it was democratic, but it was, economically successful. This gets back to something we were discussing previously, right? And so, when oppositions kind of looked around, this was a model that seemed to many worth emulating. So I think there's sort of no doubt that there's a kind of international aspect to political trends, and that's important. If we go down a level to sort of the institutions of what people like to call the liberal post-war order, I think there things get more complicated. People in the non-Western world probably saw a lot of those regimes, for sure, as much less beneficial than we in the West did. That is to say, they seemed to have benefited us more than they may have benefited people in countries that were not sort of part of that sort of Western alliance. I think what we may very well be seeing in the next couple of years is, however disadvantaged people in those parts of the world may have felt by the liberal post-war order, once it begins to disintegrate, which is the phase we are in now, whether or not that multipolar, as Senem pointed out, multipolar world will turn out to be more beneficial over the long run, I think I'm unsure of. It certainly will give countries in that non-Western camp more autonomy, which is what Senem said. But whether over the long term we will get a world that is more peaceful and economically successful than the one that we had under the previous order, that I think is an open question. I think we are going to be finding out more about that in the years to come.
Thank you. I mean, it's tempting to say, isn't it, that that one of the institutions which perhaps synthesizes the ambition both for autonomy and some degree of international coordination is a body like the G20 or something like that, which was widely decried when the Bush administration in 2008 promoted it to an intergovernmental heads of state, heads of government forum, precisely because it was doing an end run very self-consciously around institutions like the UN General Assembly that Senem invoked, right? Because the idea was you bring the significant players into the room, and if the aim of an Erdogan is to be autonomous, it's also to be a significant player. And so the G20 club perfectly, I think, encapsulates that, but it's only a very partial mechanism. I very much like your emphasis on incompleteness. I think that's a very interesting way about thinking about this entire moment. I mean, we're going to wrap at 10:45, and we've had almost an hour of discussion about this trend and its impact and its implications. When we pre-briefed on this, Shuri, you right from the outset said, what I would really like to talk about is how we even begin to think about, I think that's probably the fairest way of putting it, right? Ways of opposing, ways of rolling back, potential answers to this kind of politics. And this would seem maybe the moment in the last 20 minutes to pivot towards that angle. We have one question in the Q&A, which I would encourage our listeners to go to about social media, which I think is often seen as both an accelerant, but potentially also a space in which opposition can be mounted. Not for nothing, these regimes like to turn the internet off. Cherie, how do you see, well, give us your thoughts, give us your first thoughts. You said you've been thinking about it for months. I want to hear what you've come up with, because we need to know.
Right. Well, I wish I really had a great answer to this, Adam, because then I would be
You didn't promise me that. I'm sure.
I would be, sort of in a very good position. Look, I would say that, these kinds of questions, like what do you do when you're facing a situation where you are confronting attacks on democratic norms and institutions, but haven't reached the point, as sort of Senem and Fernando have pointed out, where the cost of opposition becomes very high, right? A regime already has significant control not only of the levers of repression, but over other kinds of areas of opposition, whether it's the media or civil society, right? Then you're shifting to a different type of strategy, right? Look, I mean, insofar as we know anything, and this is common sense, but it's worth pointing out, is it's very difficult to push back against would-be autocrats if your opposition is strongly divided. Now, again, I think that's a trivial point on some level, but I think it's a crucial place to begin. And I think, again, if we're looking at the United States, just because I'm here, although I study other parts of the world, it's just very present on my mind. This is something very clear to think about, right? Most people who are, sort of supporting the Trump administration do not necessarily see what's going on in this country as problematic. I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made to people between policies that one might disagree with. Let's say you're on the left, you disagree with a lot of Trump administration policies, and actions that are being taken that are clearly violations of democratic norms and procedures. And it's very important for oppositions facing this kind of situation where there are attacks on democratic norms and institutions to not allow themselves to be divided on other kinds of issues, because if they are, then it is very difficult to kind of push back on these kinds of violations. So I would say, sort of one obvious point is that it's very important when you're faced with this kind of situation for oppositions to somehow figure out how to unite around some kind of basic level agenda that tries to keep everyone on board. And that means often avoiding controversial or disputed issues on which one cannot achieve agreement. That is very, very difficult to do. And I think in the United States, and again, if we look at other cases, that is very important. Oppositions must be able to agree on some low-level common denominator program and avoid issues about which some sectors of that opposition may feel very strongly, but are likely to divide that opposition. Those kinds of issues should be dealt with after the immediate threat is gone. And so, this is not an easy thing to do, but it is an absolutely necessary prerequisite to begin building up a pushback against these kinds of attacks on democratic norms and procedures.
Sure. Can I ask you, would you be okay to give us a specific example of what you mean in the American context of that?
Well, I'm not sure how how much we want to get into the weeds on the American case, but there has, for instance, been a lot of attention paid to some of the kinds of issues that we talked about earlier, right? Which is some of the obvious things that Trump has done that are both clear violations of democratic norms and principles, and also have the potential to really hurt people's bottom lines, right? And so in the latter, we're talking about things like, kind of imposing tariffs on all kinds of, countries, on destabilizing the economic system in a whole variety of other ways, cutting funds for programs like, Social Security, the Social Security Administration that hurt people directly in their pocketbooks, closing down local level offices and state level offices for federal agencies that people rely on. These are the kinds of things that hit people very directly across the board, not just Democrats, but independents and also Republicans, and sort of focusing on those level issues combined with, again, places where Trump is, for example, unwilling, should he prove to be so, unwilling to comply with Supreme Court decisions. Those are the kinds of, sort of lowest common denominator issues that presumably we should be able to get agreement on, rather than, again, pushing issues on which some people feel very strongly, but you're unlikely to be able to both get agreement, and also you're likely to lose some people who you might otherwise be able to get to rethink their assessments of the current administration.
I mean, to come back to the theme of international order that we have in our panel headline, listening to you, Shri, I totally get where you're coming from. There was amazing New York Times maps of federal employees across the United States just a couple of days ago, which brought home some of the potential payoff from focusing on the bread and butter issues you're talking about. But I guess I'm kind of curious about how our panels see the role of international appeals, international structures, international powers, or perhaps also domestic. I think of like the Euromaidan, like forever associated with Europe. It's probably the most radical pro-European movement there's ever conceivably been. I think people paid with their lives for flying a blue and gold flag. I mean, is there, back to you, Shri, is there any conceivable way in which the humiliation of the US finding itself or being driven into the spot that it's being driven could actually act as a kind of glue of an opposition, which we just don't want to be this country? And are there other locations, Turkey perhaps, Hungary quite clearly, Poland, where that sense of not wanting to break out from the mainstream actually is a very powerful element, a cultural element, a way of addressing those cultural elements of populism and the making of enemies that Senem, you characterize as so central to populist politics. The refusal to be the stigmatizing regime, not wanting to be the country that persecutes its gypsy population, not wanting to be the country with the overt racism problem. See what I mean? Is there a way in which this could conceivably, or be seen at least in some cases, to be an important part of the mechanism of societal resistance to right-wing populism in particular, anyway, because that has commonly a xenophobic, nationalist dimension?
Maybe, can I just chip in very quickly,
Yeah,
Adam?
please.
I mean, was that question for Sherry? Maybe I can come in later.
No, it was to all of you. I'm just trying to continue this conversation,
Okay.
picking up with Sheri's very, I think, wise observations about coalition formation, as she says, very much derived from the domestic scene, which is really her bailiwick. So how might we see this playing back at the international level, which is our theme this morning?
Well, I think when we're looking at, what these movements are attacking or who they're attacking, we see a very similar picture across the board, women's rights, gender issues, the fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, and this and that, how they're subverting certain values and freedoms. So this is very similar, and they're learning from each other. So it would perhaps be too far-fetched to say that they're actually coordinating with one another at an international level on the basis of this sort of value project. But there's definitely a learning process that's going on. I mean, for instance, in Turkey, we have this sort of all anti-gender discourse now, which is very similar to the one in Europe and the West, even though societally, we don't have that. So there is, at a sort of general societal level. So it's very much, you can see that the elite is just looking at different examples and to see which one would work, for further polarizing and dividing the public. So they are learning, and there is a learning process. And so if that is going on, then we can actually think that, if there's one silver lining to this, is that, none of us are safe anywhere, right? So the struggle against these movements perhaps also have to take on a more transnational nature. So as nobody is immune to this, And on top of that, I think we also need to look at below the state to the sub-state level. So perhaps there should be more transnational collaboration between local governments, not just between, societal organizations or CSOs, etc., but also from local government. Because in many cases, like in Turkey or perhaps in more federal systems like US, etc., you have certain locus or places of resistance at the local level, more powerful than other countries, depending on, whether they're federal states or not. But still, so I think there is some scope for that. But the issue to think about is how to make it work, how to institutionalize it, how to formalize it, because the need is there. And I think there's huge potential there as well for more transnational engagement, because there is a learning process also in opposition. And if you look at, for instance, Turkish opposition on the streets, some of the slogans or chants or, sort of comical figures, etc., you see that now we see in the protests in Serbia as well, right? Yeah. So there is kind of contagious process there that's going on, perhaps that should be thought of in a more kind of coherent way.
I mean, Fernando, once upon a time, Latin America would have been seen as one of the absolutely central battlefields of an international politics of the left and the right. Chile was the battleground in many respects in the 1970s. I saw that you have a German trajectory in your education. One of my first political memories is of, in fact, encountering Chilean refugees in Heidelberg in '74, who I think were brought there by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. So they're very centrist German parties of the post-war era certainly saw it as their mission to think of democratization and anti-authoritarian politics as part of their solidaristic thinking. But that was also then still part of the Socialist International, right? It wasn't just the general humanitarian or rights-based discourse. It was the old internationalism of the 20th century. How do you see those sorts of forces working in Latin America today, and perhaps specifically in Chile? Is there a global dimension at this point to the struggles over the constitutional form, whether from the right or from the left or the center in Chile, or is that attenuated? Is that a thing of the past?
I don't know if you look we have had two projects to change the constitution in Chile, in the last 4 years. I think we have a worldwide record of trying to change our constitution, and we failed with the first one and also with the second one. The first one was a very left-looking constitution. The second one was a more right populism constitution. Both of these was rejected by the people. I think it's very important because Adam mentioned that what is the global context at this moment, because we talk about a new world order, and if you talk about a new world order, you have to move to this new world order and to left the old world order. And the first one is the context in Latin America. Is we have democracy for the last 2-3 decades. We move more and more to a new kind of populist governments. The third one is in the year 2000, the most important trade partners for maybe 90% of the countries was the United States. 20 years at this moment, if you look the most important trade partner for I think 59% of the and 95% of the countries is China.
Sure.
So the big question in Latin America is when you talk about a new order or a traditional world order, I think in the last 20 years Latin America moved to a kind of new world order. Because the United States are not so strong close to Latin America, they began to forget Latin America in cooperation ways and commercial and trade ways. So And China is very, very important here in Latin America for the last, I don't know, 20 years, no? So it's, for us, it's not a new kind of order, because we have to export our commodities, especially to the Asian countries, especially to China. So I think Latin America began this kind of new world order maybe in the last 10 years, no? And part of this new context, political context in Latin America, it's maybe this populist governments with a high popularity, like Bukele, like Milei. If you look the polls here in Chile, a lot of people, 65% of the people say we need a Bukele or we need a Milei. No, we don't need more liberal democracy. We need more a man with a motosierra. If you look, Milei with his discourse against the elites, the traditional elites, the casta. No, so I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think in Latin America we began a kind of new world order, maybe in the last 10 years. And China is a very, very important partner, but also a very important reason that we have this new kind of order. Thank you.
Fernando, thank you for that. That's a really interesting shift in perspective. And maybe I'll wrap things up by giving Senem and Cherie the chance to maybe respond to the China point, because I think that's a very interesting one. I mean, Cherie, you said in one of your comments earlier on that, sometimes things were simple. There's a democratic hegemon and then things follow down from there. And that world has a certain logic. And clearly we're not in that world anymore. We're in a world which is multipolar, as Senem has emphasized various times, but one could also, in economic terms, think of it as G3, G4 maybe, with China as the very least the second element, which, as Fernando has emphasized, for Latin America, as for many other parts in the world, is the major trading partner now. Does that change the game? And maybe I could just ask you both very briefly to comment on that, which is surely something which overshadows our future. I was reading some Schmidt recently, and he has that opening line about, we live under the shadow of Russia. We live under the shadow of Russia. We surely in our moment live under the shadow of China, of Beijing.
Well, I mean, okay, Cherie, you go first.
No,
Go ahead.
Please go ahead. And you're the international relations scholar anyway, so you probably have to say anyway. Go ahead.
Okay, you guys, somebody's got to start. Senem, you go, and then Cherie.
Okay, all right. No, I mean, the response to the China question depends on where the country is geographically situated, right? I mean, obviously, because for instance, in the Turkish case that you asked me about earlier, that's not really much of a issue. So, China doesn't really factor in, Turkey's both domestic politics equations, but also in terms of Turkey's foreign policy orientations. And there are some number of reasons for that. I mean, one is, of course, the fact that there has been a fear of China until recently. And now there is more interest to attract more Chinese money and investment, and as part of this strategy of regime security. But there, I think you have to keep in mind that even for China, there are certain conditions for investing. And one, of course, is that they would want to see their investments secured in place. And for instance, we have recent research which suggests that Chinese have been very reluctant to invest in Turkey precisely because they perceive Turkish authoritarianism as very volatile, and that they don't see that their investments will be protected enough. The fact that Turkey is no longer a democracy, is some kind of a competitive authoritarian regime, of course, is fine with them. But you see, the rule of violations are to the extent that they too themselves see too much of a risk. So, there is that kind of equation. So for these movements, it means that if you're going to play into China, again, you still have to make sure there's going to be some consistency and stability in the rule of law, at least in some areas, perhaps not in others. That's how I would respond to the China question.
So autonomy has its price.
Exactly. And of course, there's there's also the issue of the trade deficit, right? I mean, if you look at, you have to look at the composition of trade that China has with these countries. And for instance, for a country like Turkey, there is a huge trade deficit with countries like China and Russia, where trade with Europe is much more balanced. So when Turkey talks about, expanding into far ahead territories, including China, that's not really working in Turkey's favor when you look at the current account deficit that the Turkish economy already suffers from. So that the discourse of strategic autonomy is, yes, a discourse, but it's very difficult to achieve in practice with the structure of the Turkish economy as it is.
Yep. Cherie, do you want to come in on this?
I will say that one of the most, and there have been so many, head-spinning moments of the last several months was to see the Chinese post, I'm sure, Adam, you are aware of this as well, snippets from Ronald Reagan praising, free speech and an open trade order in response to Donald Trump's tariffs. So I just throw that out there, as I think the situation is extremely volatile. Look, I mean, China thus far has been relatively agnostic as far as regimes are concerned, as long as Senem said, they can expand their influence and expand their economic reach. Whether they have a vision for an entirely different type of world order, again, getting back to the sort of Reagan thing, other than one that allows them to be the superpower that they see themselves as being and are on their way to being, I don't have any special insight into that. I will say, though, that again, as we talked about before, we are clearly in this transition period where, the United States is actively helping to undermine an order that it helped set up after the Second World War. And many countries, especially, again, those outside of the West, are welcoming that because, again, it was an order set up and benefited, the West and perhaps much less so other parts of the world. Whether the Chinese want to replace that with something entirely different or just expand their reach, their influence in institutions that already exist, this I don't know, but we are about to find out, and we're about to find out how much better that turns out to be than one that is dominated, or institutions, multilateral institutions, and a world order that is dominated by the United States as it was during much of the post-war period. I don't have an answer to that, but we are about to find out more about that, I guess.
Thank you so much. I've often felt, since we started using Zoom regularly during the epidemic 5 years ago, that on the one hand, these conversations are absolutely fantastic, but the only really bad thing about them is the end point, because it seems so, after such a thoughtful conversation with folks on this call here, it seems rather sad to just click a button, but that is what we have to do. Thank you all for contributing in the way that you have. Thank you to the Global Centres for pulling this together and for instigating this very idea of having this series of conversations, which have been really fascinating. And I look forward, I hope, to meeting folks in person in New York or elsewhere in months and years to come. Thank you all for being here, and wishing you all a very good day, and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Robin.
Bye.
Bye.